Welcome to the debate. If you are ever rushed through the double doors of a trauma center with, severe life-threatening injuries, you'd probably assume that the most critical intervention to save your life is happening right there in the room with you.
Right. The flashing lights, the trauma surgeons, the organized chaos.
Exactly. The immediate pressure on a wound, but the reality is actually entirely different. The intervention that might actually keep you from bleeding to death, it didn't happen in that room. It happened months ago, governed by a relentlessly ticking stopwatch in a laboratory somewhere miles away.
It is the absolute definition of unseen logistical warfare. Because the moment a donor gives blood, that stopwatch starts, and what happens in the next few hours dictates exactly what kind of medicine we can even offer a dying patient.
Which brings us to a fundamental tension in hematology and emergency medicine today. We're looking at the classification, handling, and the clinical utility of blood plasma, specifically based on American standards. It's a conflict between what I would call a clinical maximalism and operational utilitarianism.
Right. The classic quality versus availability debate.
Precisely. So the core question is, should clinical standards prioritize the rigorous 8-hour freezing window of fresh frozen plasma, what we call FFP? Doing that maximizes the preservation of therapeutic clotting factors. Or, conversely, should the field favor the operational flexibility and, the immediate availability of delayed freezing and liquid plasma alternatives?
And we're going to dive right into that.
I'll be taking the former view. I argue that adhering strictly to the FFP standard is essential. The primary, overriding purpose of a plasma transfusion is to replenish a patient's plasma proteins and clotting factors. FFP must be frozen solid within exactly 8 hours of donation.
A very tight window.
It is, but that rapid deep freeze preserves these vital proteins at their absolute highest biological levels. Any delays in freezing specifically degrade labile elements. I'm talking about volatile, fragile proteins like factor V, factor VIII, and proteins C and S. Therefore, willingly settling for anything less than FFP represents an inherent, measurable compromise in therapeutic quality.
Well, the problem with demanding clinical perfection is that it often totally ignores operational reality. The strict 8-hour rule for FFP creates massive logistical bottlenecks that are frankly entirely unnecessary for the vast majority of clinical applications.
Unnecessary?
Yes, completely. We have alternative preparations, specifically plasma frozen within 24 hours, known as PF24, and plasma held at room temperature, or PF24-RT24. These maintain highly comparable, incredibly robust profiles to FFP. The guidelines explicitly note they suffer only slightly lower levels of these label factors.
But they do suffer.
Slightly. We should not be sacrificing clinical availability and causing widespread donation waste for a purely academic, negligible difference in factor VIII. That is a deeply flawed approach to resource management.
Let's dig into the actual biology of that quote-unquote negligible difference. Because looking at the molecular level tells a very different story here. FFP is the undisputed gold standard for a highly specific reason.
Sure, in a vacuum.
No, in the human body. When blood is collected, either from a whole blood donation or directly via apheresis machines, the plasma is separated and flash frozen solid at negative 18 degrees Celsius or colder, and it has to hit that state within 8 hours. That rapid plunge in temperature effectively stops time.
It preserves the profile, yes.
It locks in the highest possible levels of plasma proteins and all the critical clotting factors, keeping them stable for up to 12 months. But the moment you allow a delay, the biology starts to fail.
I wouldn't say the biology fails, it simply shifts. You get PF24.
But PF24 is a definitively degraded product. Plasma frozen within 24 hours means the plasma is stored in a refrigerator at 1 to 6 degrees Celsius for the first 8 hours, and then finally frozen somewhere between hour 8 and hour 24.
Which is vastly more practical for blood centers.
Maybe, but then you have PF24-RT24, which is left sitting out entirely at room temperature for up to 24 hours before it ever sees a freezer. Both of these share the same 12-month shelf life at negative 18 degrees. but you absolutely cannot pretend they are the identical medicine as FFP.
Well, they are classified differently by the FDA and the AABB, certainly, but they are clinically highly effective.
To understand why that delay matters, we have to explain what these factors actually do. Think of the human clotting system not as a single clump forming, but as a spectacularly complex, perfectly timed line of dominoes.
Right, the coagulation cascade.
Yes, the cascade. Factor 8 and factor 5 are crucial bridges in this cascade. If you delay freezing, it's like leaving those specific dominoes out in the rain. They begin to dissolve, and if they dissolve, the chain reaction slows down, no matter how perfect the rest of the dominoes are.
That's a bit dramatic.
It's physiological fact. When you hold plasma in the cold for PF24, the structural integrity of protein C significantly drops. When you hold it at room temperature for PF24-RT24, you see a highly specific, targeted drop in protein S. We are willingly watching vital, life-saving proteins dissolve just to buy time on the processing floor.
Look, that domino analogy is elegant, I'll give you that. But it implies a fragility that human plasma simply doesn't possess. You are looking at a living, resilient matrix as if it were a delicate glass sculpture that just shatters if the temperature isn't perfectly zeroed out.
It degrades. It doesn't shatter, it degrades.
The human body is designed for redundancy, and plasma reflects that. Let me prove it by looking at one of the most heavily manipulated blood products we have. Cryoprecipitate reduced plasma, or CSRP.
Which is essentially just the byproduct left over after you manufacture cryoprecipitate.
Exactly, and the process to make it is intense. You take an original unit of frozen plasma, you slowly thaw it just above freezing, and when you do that, a thick, cold, insoluble sludge forms at the bottom of the bag.
Cryoprecipitate.
Right. That sludge is cryoprecipitate, and it is packed with factor I, which is fibrinogen. Fibrinogen is the literal biological mortar that builds the final physical blood clot. So we completely extract that sludge for specific therapies, leaving behind the liquid supernatant. Then we take that remaining liquid and freeze it again within 24 hours.
Twice frozen.
Exactly. By the logic of your dissolving dominoes, this twice-processed, heavily stripped plasma should be essentially dead water.
Well, it is significantly depleted.
But the data explicitly shows it isn't dead. Even after all of that trauma to the product, CSP still contains near-normal levels of factor V, hovering right around 85%.
Okay, but...
And it fully retains its factor 7, its factor X, antiplasmin, antithrombin, and both of the proteins you just mentioned, protein C and S. The fact that plasma can withstand multiple temperature swings, a 24-hour delay, and the literal extraction of its heaviest proteins, yet still deliver immense therapeutic value, completely proves that delaying a freeze to 24 hours for standard plasma is not the catastrophe you are painting it to be.
You are accurately describing the resilience of certain elements, sure, but you totally glossed over the most critical part of your own example. You just admitted that creating CSP drastically reduces the fibrinogen.
I did. It extracts it.
Right. Yes, it retains 85% of factor V, but the mortar is gone. CSP is a highly specialized product used for very specific conditions, like treating TTP, thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura. It has a 12-month shelf life from the original donation date, yes, but you would never use it as a first-line defense for a generic massive hemorrhage because you know the fibrinogen is compromised.
But I'm not saying we should use CSP for trauma. I'm saying
The fact that plasma survives manipulation doesn't change the reality that we are systematically reducing its potency. We are institutionalizing a degraded product. But let's actually move this out of the laboratory for a second. Let's take this negative 18-degree freezer and put it into the reality of an emergency deployment. A 12-month shelf life is fantastic for inventory spreadsheets, but an ice block means absolutely nothing to a patient actively bleeding on a table.
Now we are getting to the actual philosophy of emergency medicine, because you are 100% right on that point. An ice block saves 0 lives, and this is exactly where thawed plasma and liquid plasma step in as the absolute workhorses of the trauma center.
Workhorses that lack the necessary biological horsepower, I would argue.
They are workhorses because they are physically available when the stopwatch is counting down in single-digit minutes. Let's map out the physical reality of FFP. You have a patient with massive trauma. They need plasma right now.
Okay.
FFP is frozen solid. You cannot microwave it. You have to carefully thaw it in an FDA-cleared water bath or an FDA-cleared thawing device at exactly 30 to 37 degrees Celsius. That takes 30 to 45 minutes depending on the volume. In a massive hemorrhage, 45 minutes is an eternity.
Which is precisely why trauma centers have proactive thawing protocols.
They do, and that creates its own tangled logistical web. Once you thaw a unit of FFP, you can't simply toss it back in the freezer if the patient stabilizes and doesn't end up needing it. It is now stored at 1 to 6 degrees Celsius, and according to the strictest standards, it is only classified as FFP for exactly 24 hours.
Yes.
But thankfully, the standards are pragmatic. If it goes unused in that 24 hours, it doesn't go in the trash. It gets redesignated as thawed plasma.
Which basically just buys it an extra 4 days of shelf life for a maximum of 5 days post-thaw.
Exactly. 5 days sitting in a refrigerator, instantly ready to hang on an IV pole. And it still contains high levels of factor V and fibrinogen, making it incredibly effective for rapid volume expansion and basic clot stabilization.
For basic stabilization, maybe.
But the true masterpiece of logistical flexibility is liquid plasma. This is plasma separated from whole blood but never frozen, not once. It is stored continuously at refrigerator temperatures, 1 to 6 degrees.
And its profile suffers because of it.
Look, the shelf life is tied to the whole blood it came from, extending 5 days beyond the expiration of the original red cell unit. So if a whole blood unit expires in 35 days, that liquid plasma can sit in a fridge, instantly ready for 40 days from donation. No water bath, no 45-minute delay. A trauma patient arrives, you open the fridge, you spike the bag, and you save a life.
Look, the speed is undeniably impressive. I will never argue that a water bath is faster than opening a refrigerator door. That's absurd. But you are completely prioritizing the delivery mechanism over the actual medicine being delivered. The text of the American standards is highly explicit about the clinical limitations of these unfrozen and prolonged liquid products.
They are transparent about it, yes.
Let's look closely at liquid plasma. Because it is never subjected to a deep freeze, the source specifically notes that it locks reasonable levels of factor V and factor VIII. Period. They are gone. And as for thawed plasma, the standards explicitly state it has, quote, lower levels of other clotting factors.
They have lower levels, yes. I'm not denying that. But they are not biologically inert.
But put yourself in the shoes of the trauma surgeon for a minute. When an emergency patient is bleeding out from a severe injury, they are rapidly developing massive coagulopathy. Their blood is literally losing the ability to clot, partly because they are bleeding out the factors faster than the liver can synthesize them, and partly because we are pumping them full of IV fluids and saline that dilute whatever factors they have left.
Which is exactly why you need volume right away.
At that exact, terrifying moment, their biological dominoes are scattered. Isn't that the specific scenario where they desperately need the most robust, comprehensive coagulation profile possible? They need peak factor V. They need peak factor VIII to build those structural bridges. Handing that surgeon a unit of liquid plasma, a product the guidelines openly admit lacks reasonable levels of those exact volatile factors, it seems fundamentally counterproductive to the physiological goal of actually stopping a severe bleed.
That assumes a binary reality, where the surgeon has a choice between a perfectly instantly thawed FFP unit and a liquid plasma unit. They don't. The alternative to giving that patient liquid plasma isn't giving them FFP. The alternative is the patient bleeds to death while you wait for the ice to melt.
That's a false choice in a well-managed hospital.
It happens every day. The slight reduction in factor V is a completely acceptable physiological trade-off for instantaneous availability. Liquid and thawed plasmas bridge the critical gap. You are stabilizing the patient's blood pressure with massive volume, and you are providing factor II and fibrinogen to get the baseline mortar laid down until your precious, perfectly preserved FFP is finally out of the water bath.
I disagree with the premise that we have to rely on degraded bridging products. A well-resourced, well-managed regional trauma center anticipates demand. They manage their thawing protocols proactively so FFP is actually ready. Your argument reveals a dangerous utilitarian mindset. This idea that good enough is an acceptable standard of care simply because it makes the inventory easier to manage.
It has absolutely nothing to do with making inventory easier, and everything to do with acknowledging the sheer scale of the American blood supply system. If you want to talk about being well-resourced, we have to look outside the major metropolitan trauma centers. We have to look at system-wide utility. If you mandate that every single unit of plasma must be frozen within 8 hours, you immediately disenfranchise thousands of mobile blood drives and rural clinics.
Disenfranchise? How so?
Think about the physical logistics. A mobile blood drive happens in a high school gymnasium in a rural county. They collect whole blood. They do not have an industrial centrifuge and a negative 18-degree blast freezer sitting on the basketball court.
Well, obviously not.
They have to put those whole blood bags in coolers, load them onto a truck, and drive them to a regional processing center. Often, by the time that truck hits the loading dock and the blood is spun down, the 8-hour stopwatch is already expired. If the FFP standard is absolute, all of that plasma is deemed substandard or thrown away. PF24 exists precisely because it allows that rural donation to become a life-saving, FDA-approved 12-month frozen product. The standards are designed to prevent catastrophic waste.
The prevention of waste is a noble goal, but let's follow that exact life cycle. What happens when plasma units actually reach their expiration date? The 12 months pass, or the 5 days for thawed plasma expire. The standards don't tell us to pour it down the drain. They intelligently reclassify it as recovered plasma.
Right. It enters an entirely different branch of the medical supply chain.
Exactly. Expired units are transformed into albumin, which is a critical protein used for treating severe burns and liver failure, and immunoglobulins, which provide essential antibodies for immune-compromised patients. This requires extremely strict regulatory conditions, but it proves that even if a hospital strictly utilizes FFP and lets unused units expire, those units still serve a profound medical purpose. Nothing is inherently wasted just because it wasn't transfused as liquid plasma.
Well, that's true. A unit of albumin doesn't stop a gunshot victim from bleeding out. We want plasma to serve its primary function first. And, if we are talking about modifying plasma to serve larger systemic goals, we really have to talk about pathogen-reduced plasma. This is one of the most significant advancements in modern blood banking,
which involves intentionally treating the plasma to destroy the DNA and RNA of potential viruses and bacteria.
Correct. We take plasma derived from whole blood or apheresis and treat it with specific technologies, often using a compound like psoralen combined with ultraviolet light. This explicitly targets and neutralizes pathogens, drastically reducing the risk of transmitting HIV, hepatitis, or emerging infections. Now, does blasting plasma with UV light slightly degrade some of the raw clotting factors? Yes. But the field as a whole has recognized that proactively intervening to guarantee an infection-free product absolutely trumps the preservation of every last percentage point of factor VIII. Safety wins over raw factor preservation.
I fully support the goals of pathogen reduction, and I agree that manufacturing albumin from recovered plasma is a triumph of medical recycling. I also support the collection of source plasma via specialized apheresis under defined requirements. But frankly, bringing up pathogen-reduced plasma actually reinforces my core philosophy.
Wait, how? I don't see how admitting that we intentionally degrade factors for safety supports your argument for clinical maximalism.
Because the handling of those derivatives and the processing of pathogen-reduced plasma requires the absolute highest level of precision. The guidelines strictly state that the handling of pathogen-reduced plasma after thawing, such as whether it can be refrozen or exactly how long it can be stored, depends entirely on the specific proprietary technology used to clean it. The rules are absolute and unforgiving.
Well, sure, it's a proprietary process.
But the sheer complexity of these variables, whether we are talking about collection methods, exact separation timing, or highly specific post-thaw storage limits, it demonstrates my point perfectly. Specific clinical interventions require rigid, precise, uncompromising handling rules. The moment we start treating plasma as a generic, flexible commodity just to keep the shelf stocked, We are failing the specific needs of the patient's biology.
But nobody in the hematology community is treating it as a generic commodity. The very nuance of these guidelines proves that we deeply respect the complexity of the product. The American standards have intelligently created a tiered toolkit. They recognize that an underfunded county hospital might not have rapid freezing infrastructure, but they can still provide PF24. They recognize a frantic ER nurse doesn't have 45 minutes, so they provide 40-day liquid plasma. The standards allow the medical system to provide a comparable life-saving product right this second, rather than a perfect product 45 minutes too late.
I hear you. As we draw this debate to a close, though, I want to clearly summarize the position of clinical maximalism. I understand the intense logistical pressure that regional blood centers and hospital blood banks face. The physical reality of transporting and processing thousands of donations across vast geographies is incredibly complex.
Highly complex, yes. But the 8-hour standard for fresh frozen plasma must remain our undisputed target, not just some academic ideal. By rapidly dropping that temperature and locking in the absolute maximum levels of labile elements, specifically factors V, 8, and protein C and S, FFP represents the uncompromising gold standard of patient care. Every time we permit a delay in freezing, whether it's for 24 hours in a cold refrigerator for PF24 or 24 hours at room temperature for PF24 RT24, we are making a conscious choice to let vital, life-saving therapeutic dominoes dissolve before they ever reach the patient. And I will summarize the utilitarian stance by acknowledging that, well, while FFP is biochemically optimal in a vacuum, medicine is not practiced in a vacuum. It is practiced in messy, chaotic, time-constrained reality. The operational flexibility of PF24 and PF24 RT24 is what prevents catastrophic bottlenecks in our national donation supply chain, allowing rural and mobile donations to actually reach patients.
At a cost to the factors.
But more importantly, the immediate emergency readiness of thawed plasma, and especially liquid plasma, which can wait on standby for up to 40 days without ever needing a water bath, it undeniably saves more lives in practice. A massive hemorrhage requires an immediate response, and the minor, totally acceptable reductions in specific clotting factors are a small price to pay for a product that is ready the instant a patient arrives. Operational flexibility is the true lifesaver.
We do find significant common ground, however, in the breathtaking efficiency of the blood banking EFA system as a whole. I mean, the fact that the system is designed so that even deeply expired plasma that has completely aged out of its clinical transfusion window, still finds profound life-saving use in the manufacturing of albumin and immunoglobulins. It is a genuine testament to the ingenuity of modern medicine.
Oh, absolutely. From the moment the donation occurs, the entire architecture of the guidelines is designed to honor the donor's gift by ensuring literally zero biological material is wasted.
As we leave you today, consider the sheer complexity of the toolkit we've explored. Variables like exact time down to the hour, temperatures ranging from -18 degrees up to human body warmth, complex centrifuge separation methods, and meticulous thawing protocols. They don't offer a single, universally perfect answer, but rather a wide spectrum of highly specific clinical choices. We encourage you to look deeper into the specific guidelines utilized in your own local blood centers and hospitals. And the next time you picture a dramatic medical emergency, remember that unseen stopwatch relentlessly ticking away in a quiet laboratory, hours, days, or even months before those trauma bay doors ever swing open.
It really is all about time.
Thank you for joining us.